Dawn came soft and gold over the Texas plains, spilling across a horizon that seemed to have no end. The barbed wire shimmered in the new light like silver threads strung between wooden posts, and beyond it stood a small group of Japanese women, their silhouettes fragile against the endless sky. The wind carried a strange perfume: smoke, coffee, frying bacon. For a moment, none of them moved. They simply stared, as if the scent itself were a trick of the mind, a mirage conjured by hunger and disbelief. They had arrived 3 days earlier, exhausted and silent, brought by military truck to a prisoner of war camp near Hereford. Their uniforms were threadbare, the insignias torn away. Their faces, once powdered and proud, were gaunt and burned by sun and salt. They had survived transport across the Pacific and the long, rattling train that cut through fields of corn and cotton until they reached this alien stillness, the American Southwest, a place of cows, windmills, and men as big as barns. In Japan, the propaganda had painted the Americans as beasts, giants who devoured captives, men without mercy. Yet when the trucks stopped and the gates opened, it wasn't snarling soldiers who greeted them. It was cowboys. Towering men with soft drawls, sweat-darkened hats, and belt buckles that gleamed like mirrors. They weren't shouting. They were joking. One of them even tipped his hat, as though greeting guests at a Sunday picnic. The women were too stunned to respond. Among them was a nurse named Yuki, 25, whose trembling hands still bore the calluses of battlefield bandages. Another, Aiko, had once been a schoolteacher in Nagasaki before the air raids began. They stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching their issued blankets, unsure whether to bow, salute, or run. Instead, they watched as a cowboy with shoulders broad as a doorframe began cracking eggs into a black skillet. The sizzle made them flinch. That morning, the mess hall was filled with light and laughter that felt utterly foreign. The smell of bacon fat danced with the scent of hot bread. Steam curled upward, golden in the morning beams that poured through open windows. The women sat stiffly on benches, hands folded, eyes lowered. When the plates were placed before them, eggs glistening, toast buttered, a slice of something called bacon, none dared move first. Yuki stared at her reflection in the yellow yolk. It looked like the rising sun of her country's flag, cracked and trembling. She hadn't seen that color in months. In the jungle camps, breakfast had been a spoon of rice, if any. Once, she'd eaten bark to quiet her stomach. Now an American soldier, a giant with freckles and a smile that didn't fit the war, was saying, "Eat up, ma'am," as if he were serving at a diner. The first bite was slow, mechanical. Then warmth spread through her, shocking in its sweetness and salt. She wasn't sure whether to cry or spit it out. The other women ate silently too, their hands shaking. For the first time since surrender, they were fed not as enemies, but as humans. The sound of chewing filled the room like prayer. Outside, the camp stirred with the rhythm of a small American town. Radios played jazz. The flag flapped lazily above the gate. And somewhere beyond the fences, cattle lowed under the open blue. Aiko, the teacher, couldn't help noticing how the sky here seemed wider than anywhere she'd ever seen. She whispered, "It's too big," and one of the cowboys overheard. "You'll get used to it," he said with a grin. "Everything's big in Texas." That line made its way through the camp like an echo, half joke, half prophecy. Everything was big. The men, the sky, the food, even the kindness. It was too much for women raised on scarcity and silence. At night they whispered to one another in the barracks, wondering if this was part of the Americans' punishment, to drown them in generosity until they no longer remembered who they were. But the truth was simpler and stranger. The American guards had been ranchers, farmhands, mechanics, ordinary men who traded plows for rifles and found themselves guarding prisoners instead of cattle. To them, feeding the enemy wasn't politics. It was habit. You didn't let a person starve on your land. You gave them breakfast. One afternoon, as the women worked mending uniforms in the laundry, Yuki saw a guard carefully set down a crate of eggs. He wiped his brow and said, "We'll get y'all more tomorrow. Hens ain't tired yet." The phrase meant nothing to her, yet the warmth in his tone made her chest tighten. When he left, she touched one of the eggs, cool and white, and whispered, "Tamago." It sounded like home. At sunset, when the desert turned pink and gold, they gathered near the fence and listened to the cowboys singing. The songs were slow, full of longing, something about wide rivers and women waiting somewhere far away. The melodies curled around the barbed wire, gentle and human. The women didn't understand the words, but they recognized the ache. Each day in the camp peeled away another layer of what they thought they knew about enemies. The Americans joked about the weather, offered cigarettes, and called them ladies. The Japanese women began to answer with shy nods, small smiles. Humanity, it seemed, had slipped through the cracks of the war's armor. Yet beneath the comfort ran confusion, a quiet unease that none dared name. How could kindness exist in captivity? How could the same country that dropped fire from the sky serve breakfast with a smile? Yuki thought of her brother, lost at Okinawa, and felt guilt for every bite she took. But hunger is stronger than pride, and the scent of bacon stronger than memory. By the 10th morning, the women no longer flinched when the pans hissed. They waited for the sound, even found comfort in it. Yuki learned to say, "Thank you," in English. Aiko started teaching a young guard how to write his name in Japanese characters. The war outside their fence still existed, but inside, something delicate was thawing, like snow melting off spring soil. And then, one morning, as the sun rose red over the plains, a truck pulled into camp carrying a new group of prisoners. Men, wounded, hollow-eyed. The Cowboys turned somber. The smell of bacon lingered, heavy and haunting. The women watched as the doors opened and realized, with a shock, that some of those faces were Japanese soldiers, men they had once saluted. The eggs on their plates grew cold. In that instant, warmth met memory, and mercy collided with guilt. The women looked toward the towering Americans, then back to the men who had been their commanders. Somewhere between the fences, the war had followed them home. And the breakfast that once felt like salvation now tasted of something else entirely, something they could neither swallow nor refuse. The wind rolled across the plains like an old song, low, steady, and endless. Inside the camp, it carried the scent of hay and machine oil, blending with soap and sweat, the strange symphony of life behind barbed wire. The Japanese women had been there long enough for the rhythm of captivity to sink into their bones. The mornings began with the clang of the mess bell and the calls of distant cattle. The guards joked about the heat, their laughter echoing through the open spaces like birds that didn't know cages. Yuki rose each morning before the sun fully climbed. She would sit by the window of the barack, brushing her hair in slow, deliberate strokes, watching the dust float like tiny ghosts in the golden light. For the first time in years, she could hear herself think. The silence was vast, too vast. Aiko, always the teacher, found scraps of paper and began sketching the outline of mountains, trying to remember what Japan's valleys had looked like before they burned. She shared the drawings with the others, calling it her way of keeping home alive. The American guards were a strange breed, half soldiers, half cowhands. They walked with the lazy confidence of men who belonged to wide spaces, their spurs jangling softly against the dry earth. The Japanese women, barely 5 feet tall, seemed like porcelain beside them. But over time, the fear that had frozen them on arrival began to crack. The guards weren't cruel. They were curious. One of them, Corporal Miller, a farm boy from Amarillo, spoke slowly, carefully, trying to teach them English through gestures. He'd point to his Stetson hat, saying, "Hat." Then he'd point to his chest, "Miller." The women giggled when they tried to mimic his drawl. Work became a kind of language, too. They sewed uniforms, laundered shirts, tended vegetable patches that stretched along the outer fence. The soil was stubborn, but Yuki's hands were patient. She found a kind of therapy in the act of planting, pressing each seed into the ground as if offering a prayer. The guards sometimes helped, their shadows falling long across the rows of beans and corn. One afternoon, Miller crouched beside her, his voice quiet. "Never thought I'd be teachin' gardening to a nurse from Tokyo." She looked up, unsure of the words, but his smile told her she didn't need to answer. The contrast between their worlds was dizzying. These cowboys, giants with sunburned necks and voices rough as gravel, treated them with the same easy respect they'd give a neighbor's wife. To them, captivity wasn't cruelty, it was responsibility. Aiko began calling them gentle giants, a phrase that made Yuki laugh at first. But she understood. They were the kind of men who fixed fences, fed horses, and tipped their hats even to prisoners. At noon, The heat shimmered across the camp like glass. The women worked in light cotton blouses, their hair tied back, while the guards dozed under the shade of the mess hall porch. Beyond the fence, the plains rippled toward the horizon. It was freedom, visible but untouchable. That horizon became both comfort and torment, so close, so infinite. Yuki sometimes imagined walking toward it until the earth swallowed her. Yet she never moved. The barbed wire gleamed like a silver reminder that freedom, here, was an illusion painted in sunlight. Still, kindness began to shift the air. The Americans played country songs on harmonicas during evening roll call. The women, at first bewildered, started humming along. One night, Aiko clapped her hands to the rhythm, and the guards cheered as though they'd found a common language. That was the night someone, no one ever confessed who, drew a small chalk line on the ground just inside the fence. The guards called it the invisible border. They'd toss apples or biscuits across it, laughing as the women pretended not to catch them. It was a game that said what no treaty could. The war outside might rage on, but here, the human heart refused to obey. There were, of course, moments of tension. When letters arrived from home, thin, crumpled sheets carrying news of bombings or famine, the laughter died. Yuki once received a message from her cousin. Their village gone, her mother's fate unknown. She sat by the fence that evening, staring at the sky until the stars blurred. Miller approached quietly and placed something beside her, a tin cup of warm milk. "My ma used to say it helps," he murmured. She didn't look at him, only whispered, "Arigato." The word hung between them like fragile glass. Over time, the women began to reclaim small pieces of themselves. They sewed their own robes from discarded fabric. Aiko embroidered cherry blossoms along her sleeves. The guards teased her, calling her Miss Japan, but when she walked through the camp wearing it, heads turned. In a place built for uniformity, beauty felt like rebellion. One morning, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds stretching over the plains like bruises. The wind tore at the fences, rattling tin roofs and slamming doors. The women huddled inside, listening to thunder shake the sky. Then came a cry. The horse pen had broken open. The guards ran out, boots splashing through mud, shouting orders. Without thinking, Yuki and Aiko followed. They had tended those horses for months. They couldn't bear to see them hurt. Lightning split the horizon. Rain lashed across the camp as they helped corral the animals back inside. Yuki's hair clung to her face, her bare feet slipping in the muck. Miller caught her arm just as a fence post gave way, pulling her clear. For a moment they stood close, breathing hard, soaked to the bone. His hand lingered on her wrist before he let go. Neither spoke. The storm passed, leaving the earth steaming, the air heavy with the scent of rain and hay. Something unspoken had passed between them, something neither culture had a word for. In the days that followed, the camp felt different. The laughter came easier, the silences deeper. Yuki often caught Miller watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't know what to make of it, whether it was pity, admiration, or the simple wonder of seeing an enemy smile. But news traveled on the wind, as it always does. Rumors of Japan's surrender were spreading, whispered from guard to guard. The war was ending. Freedom, the word that had haunted them all, was approaching like a dust storm on the horizon, unstoppable, uncertain. One night, as the sun bled red over the barbed wire, Yuki looked out toward the horizon and felt both hope and dread. The open skies that had once seemed vast and merciful now looked too wide, too empty. The fences no longer felt like walls. They felt like fragile lines holding back a world she no longer recognized. Behind her, the cowboys sang softly, their voices fading into the wind. And as she closed her eyes, Yuki realized with a shiver that captivity had become its own kind of safety. Freedom, when it came, would not be a sunrise. It would be a storm. The days began to stretch like the Texas horizon, long, warm, and strangely gentle. The war was ending, though no one inside the camp could quite believe it. The newspapers that reached the guards spoke of cities reduced to ash, of an emperor's voice breaking through the radio static. Yet inside those fences, life unfolded with an almost stubborn tenderness, as if humanity itself refused to die. Each morning, Yuki walked to the mess hall carrying a tin bucket of laundry water, her wooden clogs clicking softly on the packed dirt. The smell of soap and frying cornbread filled the air, blending with the hum of English words she still didn't fully understand. Miller stood by the kitchen door most mornings, coffee cup in hand, watching the women with quiet amusement. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod, not of authority but acknowledgement. Yuki found herself nodding back, though she didn't know why. The camp had become a strange classroom, and kindness its unspoken curriculum. The guards had begun teaching English to the prisoners in the evenings, using chalkboards propped against barrels. The lessons were clumsy but sincere. "Bread," one of them would say, holding up a slice. "Butter." The women repeated the words, giggling when their accents tangled. In return, Aiko began teaching the Americans bits of Japanese, drawing characters in the dust with a stick. One night, Miller bent down beside her and traced his name in hiragana. The lines were crooked, but his grin was boyish proud. For a moment, the war between them felt impossibly small. Letters began arriving again. Some women received news of families who'd survived. Others learned they had no home left to return to. The camp laundry became a place of quiet confession, the hiss of steam hiding soft weeping. When Aiko learned that her younger brother had been killed during the firebombing of Tokyo, she didn't cry immediately. She folded the letter once, then again, then placed it under her blouse. Only later, when Miller brought her a handful of wildflowers from beyond the fence, did she break down, clutching them as if they were relics of another world. For Yuki, the lessons of kindness came slower, like seeds germinating beneath hard soil. She'd spent years stitching wounds in jungle hospitals, where compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Yet here, in captivity, compassion came uninvited. One afternoon, while she hung laundry on the line, a sandstorm whipped suddenly through the camp. Sheets flew, dust blinded the air. She covered her face, coughing, when strong hands pulled her into the shelter of a storage shed. It was Miller, his hat gone, hair streaked with sand. "Storm'll pass," he said. She could barely hear him, but the calm in his voice stilled her shaking. When the storm finally cleared, they stepped out into a sky washed clean, the light sharp and new. Yuki realized then that she had trusted an American without meaning to. The days that followed were filled with small miracles. The women began baking with rations, experimenting with American ingredients. Someone discovered the joy of peanut butter, another learned to make biscuits. The guards joined in, tasting the results with exaggerated approval. It became a ritual, a feast of mistakes and laughter. When one of the women accidentally added salt instead of sugar, Miller grinned and said, "That's how we do it in Amarillo," earning laughter from both sides of the fence. But beneath the laughter, an ache lingered. Every act of kindness carried the weight of its own contradiction. How could generosity come from those who had defeated them? How could warmth live inside the ruins of war? Yuki wrestled with that question each night, sitting on her bunk beneath the whisper of the desert wind. She began writing in a small notebook she'd bartered from a guard. Fragments of memory, sketches of faces, the smell of bacon, the sound of rain. She wrote not to remember the war, but to remember this strange peace that existed in its shadow. Aiko found purpose in teaching again. She organized small lessons for the younger women, English phrases, sewing techniques, even bits of arithmetic. "Learning," she said softly, "is freedom no one can take." Her resilience became contagious. Soon, laughter returned to the barracks, carried by the rhythm of needle and thread. They began stitching tiny flowers onto their clothes, symbols of survival blooming quietly against gray fabric. One evening, the guards set up a makeshift projector against the side of a Quonset hut. The women gathered as the machine sputtered to life, throwing flickering black and white images onto the wall. It was a Charlie Chaplin film. For an hour, they forgot everything: the war, the fences, the hunger that had once defined them. They laughed until their sides hurt, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten joy. Miller watched from the back, his arms crossed, smiling at the sound. Later, Yuki approached him and said, carefully, "You make us laugh." He shook his head. "No, ma'am," he replied. "You did that yourselves." The boundary between captor and captive blurred with each passing day. When one of the older Japanese women fell ill, the camp's medic, an ex-cowboy with calloused hands, sat by her bed all night. The next morning, he brewed tea the way he'd seen Yuki do it, awkwardly balancing the kettle over the stove. When she woke, he said simply, "Guess it's my turn to learn." That was the moment Yuki realized kindness was not the property of any nation. It was the rebellion of the soul against cruelty. But even kindness has limits. Word arrived that the camp would soon close. The prisoners were to be repatriated. The announcement fell like a stone into still water, ripples of silence spreading through the yard. The women who had once prayed for release now stared at the ground, afraid to imagine what awaited them beyond the barbed wire. For many, Japan was no longer home. It was memory, ashes, ghosts. In the final week, Miller came to say goodbye. He handed Yuki a folded photograph of the camp horses grazing under sunset. "For when you miss the big sky," he said. She took it with trembling hands, unable to find words. In her chest, something both heavy and luminous bloomed, a gratitude that hurt. That night, she wrote one last line in her notebook. "They taught us the enemy's heart can hold warmth." Then she closed it, listening to the quiet. Somewhere beyond the desert, ships waited to carry them home. But home, she thought, was no longer where she had left it. It was here, in this strange place where Mercy had worn a cowboy's hat. And as dawn crept over the plains, the wind carried the faint smell of breakfast, eggs and bacon again, rising like memory, like forgiveness. The trucks came before sunrise, their engines growling like beasts in the mist. Dust rose behind them in long, quiet plumes as soldiers stepped down to call the names from a clipboard. Each name marked an ending, a life suspended between two worlds finally being set loose. The women stood in line with their few belongings wrapped in cloth, the desert wind tugging at their skirts. Freedom had come at last, but it felt nothing like what they had imagined. Yuki clutched the small notebook she had written in for months, its corners soft from handling. She kept glancing toward the mess hall where smoke still curled from the chimney, carrying that familiar scent of bacon and coffee. For so long, those smells had meant captivity. Now they felt like home. Aiko stood beside her, holding a bundle of sewing needles and the photograph of the camp horses Miller had once given them. Her eyes were red from the sleepless night before. "Do you think Japan will even recognize us?" she whispered. Yuki didn't answer. The guards tried to keep the mood light. They offered the women coffee, biscuits, even a few jokes. Miller was among them, his Stetson hat pulled low, his face roughened by the sleepless week. When his gaze met Yuki's, it lingered for a fraction longer than it should have. The unspoken hung between them, gratitude, confusion, and something dangerously close to affection. He wanted to say something but didn't. There were no words left that could fit inside this farewell. 4 months, the fences had been their horizon, defining the edges of safety and the boundaries of fear. Now the gates stood open, and beyond them stretched the limitless plains of Texas, gold with morning light. It should have been beautiful, yet to Yuki it looked like the edge of a cliff. The freedom she had prayed for now loomed like an abyss. One of the women began to cry, a soft, broken sound that spread quickly through the group. Others joined her, quietly at first, then louder, until the air was filled with muffled sobs. The guards stood frozen, helpless against the storm of emotion. "You're free now," one said gently, but his words felt thin against the enormity of it. A convoy of military trucks waited at the far end of the camp, ready to carry them to the port. Yuki's feet refused to move. Every plank, every shadow, every sound of this place had become part of her. She could still see herself arriving months ago, starved, terrified, expecting brutality, and now she was leaving with a full stomach and a heart she no longer understood. Miller approached her slowly. "You take care now, Miss Yuki," he said softly, his drawl cracked with something close to sorrow. He handed her a folded paper bag. Inside were 2 biscuits, still warm. "For the road." She stared at it, unable to speak. Finally, she said, "I remember. You teach. Freedom." He nodded. "Guess we both learned it, huh?" The sky was widening into blue. Somewhere beyond that horizon, ships waited to take them back across the Pacific. The women climbed onto the trucks, their skirts catching on the wooden rails. The engines roared to life. Dust rose again. From her seat, Yuki looked back at the camp one last time, the barbed wire glinting like a silver halo, the guard tower framed against the sun, the cowboy hats catching the light. It was a sight she had once hated. Now it felt like something sacred. Aiko sat beside her, clutching her needles, whispering fragments of a Japanese lullaby. Yuki closed her eyes, and in her mind she heard the morning bell, the laughter in the mess hall, the distant harmonica played under the stars. It was strange, she thought, how captivity had taught her to breathe again. How mercy, when offered by those she'd been taught to hate, could feel like a wound she didn't want to heal. Hours passed as the trucks rumbled toward the coast. The land shifted from open fields to hills thick with pine. Along the way, American children waved from porches, their innocence cutting through the haze of war. Some women waved back, others turned away. Yuki stared at the horizon, her hands clenched around the notebook in her lap. Every page inside it told the story of two nations colliding, not with gunfire, but with breakfast plates and barbed wire. At the port, the sea waited, wide and gray, its waves lapping against the steel hulls of waiting ships. The women stepped out, the salt wind tugging at their hair. American officers guided them toward the gangway, checking lists, counting heads. It was efficient, impersonal, final. Yuki paused halfway up the ramp and turned back one last time. On the dock stood Miller, his hat in his hands. The wind caught his hair, the sunlight painting his shoulders gold. For a heartbeat, he looked like one of the statues she'd seen in Kyoto temples. Steady, human, impossible to forget. He lifted his hand in a small salute. She returned it, her fingers trembling. No words were exchanged, but the silence carried everything. Gratitude, sorrow, and the faint, unbearable truth that sometimes the enemy teaches you how to be human again. As the ship's horn bellowed and the shoreline began to fade, the women gathered along the railing. Aiko leaned close, whispering, "Maybe kindness is a kind of war too, only it conquers differently." Yuki smiled faintly. The sea stretched before them like eternity, but her mind stayed anchored to that morning in Texas. The sound of eggs sizzling, the smell of coffee, the warmth of a man who never raised his voice. When night fell, the stars came out over the Pacific, bright and merciless. Yuki opened her notebook and began to write her final line. Freedom is not the absence of walls, but the presence of mercy. She closed it, holding it against her heart. Behind her, the engines hummed, and the waves whispered their endless rhythm. Somewhere far away, the war had ended, but in her chest, a quieter battle still burned, a longing that no victory could erase. And as dawn began to rise again, Yuki finally understood that the hardest part of freedom was learning how to let go of the kindness that had saved her. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.